Today's episode is brought to you by Huel. A French physician and astrologer, Michel de Nostredame, better known as Nostradamus, is probably best known for his Les Prophéties, a collection of cryptic quatrains that many have since claimed have foretold world events. Now, as you can imagine, readers over the last few centuries have debated meticulously as to whether such verses do contain genuine glimpses into the future, or if they're just merely poetic riddles that are open to endless interpretation. If you were to consult author Mario Redding's work, you would be told that it is most definitely the former. Indeed, Redding suggested that not only could Nostradamus' work be beneficial, as he says, forewarned is forearmed, but that we can see evidence of his predictions in some of history's tragedies. Redding believed Nostradamus successfully predicted an assassination of a world leader between 2006 and 2008, and whilst Redding incorrectly guessed that this would be of President George Bush, a political assassination did transpire in 2007, where former Prime Minister and stateswoman of Pakistan, Benazir Bhutto, was killed in a suicide bombing. According to Redding, Nostradamus in his various quatrains also predicted 9/11, where the stanza reads, "Earth-shaking, a fire from the center of the earth will shake the towers of the new city. As a result, two great rocks will fight a long war, until a Rethuson springs bloody the river afresh." Other correct predictions, according to Redding, include the opening of the Guantanamo Bay detention camp, the US-Iraq War, the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004, and the death of Pope John Paul II in 2005, popes being something of Nostradamus' speciality. Whilst other predictions by Nostradamus appear to be right on the money, at least according to Redding, in this video we'll be looking at Redding's interpretations of what Nostradamus had written in regards to the years beyond 2025, and what these quatrains might mean for us as we advance into the scary unknown of the future. One thing you won't have to worry about though is meal prep, because with today's sponsor Huel, getting your hands on a nourishing meal that also supplies you with all the nutrients you need with the right amount of protein, essential fats, carbohydrates, fiber, vitamins and minerals has never really been easier. Huel kindly sent me a few options from their Discover bundle, all of which have been game-changing for my daily routine, saving me time and energy. Stay tuned for more details coming up. According to Redding's book, The Complete Prophecies for the Future, Nostradamus doesn't have all that much to say about 2025. No mentions of tariffs, the rise of AI, and nothing about Charlie Kirk. Going by Redding's interpretation, the only thing Nostradamus has in store for us in 2025 is the deepening of the conflict between the Sunni and Shia tribes, whereby this ancient schism leads to an all-out Islamic war. The basis of this divide stems all the way back to the first generation of Muslims, and boils down to the question of how was the Prophet Muhammad to be succeeded as leader of the Muslim community. The Sunnis, which constitute around 85% of all Muslims, would argue that the Prophet Muhammad could not necessarily be succeeded, but rather a caliph would be selected by Muhammad's tribe, the first being Abu Bakr, Muhammad's father-in-law. The caliph did not inherit Muhammad's spiritual powers, but rather only maintain administrative and legal power. The Shia Muslims, meanwhile, constitute the remaining 15% of Muslims and reject the idea of the caliph, believing that the Prophet Muhammad appointed a spiritual successor in his son-in-law Ali. Unlike the Sunni caliph, Abu Bakr, Ali did inherit Muhammad's spiritual powers, his waliya, and became the first of 12 imams or leaders. This waliya, these special abilities, were passed down through Ali's sons all the way up to the 12th imam Muhammad al-Mahdi in the year 974, who is believed to be something of a messianic figure who will return in the end times to restore peace and justice upon the earth. The entire quatrain reads, "The Arab prince Mars, the sun, Venus and the lion, the reign of the church will be vanquished at sea. close to 1 million men will head towards Persia, Byzantium, Egypt. The followers of the true serpent will invade. It should be noted that Redding doesn't sound all that sure of himself when interpreting this quatrain and applying it to a Sunni-Shia conflict. In fact, he asks the reader, could we then be talking of a Sunni-Shia rift? Now, the potential for such a rift isn't out of the realm of possibility for 2025. I mean, conflicts have been known to happen between these tribes throughout history, and according to the New India Express, a convoy of 35 vehicles delivering aid to Pakistan's Kuram district were attacked in 2025 with rockets, in what is dubbed as sectarian violence. Whilst no group claims responsibility, there is some suggestion that this was a religiously motivated attack. The article notes that this would bring the death toll up to 130 in various clashes between the Shia and Sunni tribes since November of the previous year. However, to suggest that there would be a war between these two groups based on Nostradamus' writings alone is a bit of a stretch if you ask me. Mario attempts to interpret Mars, the Sun, Venus, and the Lion as attributes of the Arab prince in line 1, with Mars being the alchemical symbol for iron, the Sun for gold, and Venus for copper, and that these are transmutable into human characteristics. He also attributes the lion to various Muslim agnomens and nicknames, suggesting that the lion in this context is of Islamic standing. Interestingly, Mario doesn't mention the second, more scathing line, that the reign of the church will be vanquished at sea. If we were to take this literally, you might say that Christianity as the dominant religion is eventually overtaken, likely by the second most popular religion, Islam. Though the term vanquished implies that this is much more severe, it isn't just the numbers of Islam overtaking Christianity in popularity, but perhaps the dilation or dissolution of Christianity altogether. This can be further corroborated by the third line, that close to 1 million men will head towards Persia. 98% of Iranians, or Persians if you go by Nostradamus' time, are believed to be nominal Muslims, and so if close to 1 million men are heading there, then you might say that there is something of a mass conversion amongst Christians, or that more people become receptive to the practices and beliefs of Islam. Lastly, Nostradamus' words speak of the followers of the true serpent, and going by Christian iconography, the serpent is usually attributed to Satan, who is believed to be crushed under the heel of man, as is the case in the Genesis account. The serpent in the Bible and the serpent in this quatrain by Nostradamus are essentially the same. They are evil in the eyes of the author, yet this serpent is still nonetheless described here as invading. Redding believed that Nostradamus was equating the serpent here with Muslims, especially considering his Catholic and Jewish influence, and so you might reconcile that this quatrain predicts an Islamic invasion of some kind. Now, to be clear, it should be noted that this is one of many ways to interpret the only prediction of 2025 in Redding's work, and whilst it sounds quite scathing against Muslims, and also makes for a pretty baity thumbnail, it should not be taken literally. An interesting part of Redding's work is that he leaves 2026 blank. Apparently, Nostradamus didn't predict anything noteworthy happening in this year, and so without tempting fate, maybe no news is good news. Dare I say that 2026 might actually be a decent year for everyone. One way you can ensure that 2026 is your year is by checking out the new Discovery Bundle from Huel, which you can actually get 50% off by using my link on screen. I'm one of those rare people who actually do try and stick to my New Year's resolutions, but it's actually been made even more simple by Huel because now I don't have to spend as much time in the kitchen fussing over my pre-workout meals. In 2025, I was using the Huel Black Edition High Protein Powder Meal, which saved me a ton of time so I could focus more on my hobbies. Genuinely, having some of my meals just ready to go thanks to Huel did allow me to commit more time to reading and research. All I needed to do was add 500 milliliters of water to 1 to 2 scoops of the powder, shake it up, and was ready to go. However, Huel have now introduced their Discovery Bundle with a bunch of new products. I've always found the pre-made drinks to be really useful, especially if I'm tired after the gym and can't be bothered to make something. This was probably my favourite go-to product, but now Huel have also introduced the ready-to-drink greens line, which I think is perfect for someone who doesn't like eating their greens. Very much targeted at me, I think. Honestly, I thought it was going to be pretty grim. I just never liked eating my greens, but in this drinkable format, it's actually pretty good. You can see it's actually formulated from kale, spinach, broccoli, various fruits, all those good things I regretfully sometimes lack in my own diet. These also come in the sachet format, which are included in the Discovery Bundle. Considering the amount of items you get, the Discover Bundle really is worth it. But with my discount, it's really a steal. All of which you can now obtain 50% off of only by using my link www.huel.com/legendh15 or scan the QR code on screen. And now on to 2027. Just like 2025, 2027 only features one prediction, and according to Redding, this is a great war between Pakistan and India. In the islands, where 5 rivers flow into one, by the crescent of the great Shiren Selene, the fury of one man will float on the mist, 6 will escape, hidden in a load of linen. One of my issues with Redding's work is that he does go on a bit of a tirade with things. He's probably worse than me. He dissects each stanza with such focus and exhaustiveness that it doesn't always connect that feasibly with his greater interpretation. For instance, in this quatrain, he compares this great Shiren Selene to an amalgamation of Charon, the boatman of the river Styx, and Selene, the moon goddess. He also spends a great deal of time referring to the crescent of this amalgamation to the founder of the Ottoman Empire, Sultan Othman, none of which seems to have any relevance to a potential breakout of war between Pakistan and India. He then goes into a painfully obscure interpretation using mystic numbers to identify the 6 men who escape as being those who cheat Shiren Selene on the way to Hades. Again, none of this pertains to the would-be India-Pakistan conflict. In fact, he barely attempts to tie any of it together in this instance, and simply tells us that Punjab in Hindi means 5 rivers, and it is conceivable that Nostradamus is speaking of a war between India and Pakistan, as the region of Punjab is divided between the 2 countries. Where he gets war from, I don't know. The line reads, "In the islands where 5 rivers flow into one." And to me it really doesn't sound connotative of war. If anything, it sounds more like a consolidation of peace, water being the sustenance of life. Come to think of it, it's not clear why he takes the Hindi translation of Punjab and tries to shoehorn it into his explanation. Yes, the Hindi word for Punjab is 5 rivers, or the land of 5 waters, but he seems to have plucked this one out of thin air if you ask me. In any case, if there is a war in 2027 between India and Pakistan, which again isn't entirely out of the realm of possibility considering the political climate of today, then I will deep fry my hat in marzipan and I will in fact eat that hat because it does sound quite tasty. When Venus is covered by the sun, shapes will be concealed beneath its splendour. Mercury, with its fire, will expose them. They will be misused in war. Redding deploys his knowledge of metallurgy, or metal alchemy again, to tell us that Venus was associated with copper, the Sun with gold, and the planet Mercury with, of course, mercury. These, he tells us, are all alchemical totems, and because they appear as they do in Nostradamus' quatrain, he believes we are therefore dealing with the transmutation of metals. The copper is covered by the gold, and then Mercury will expose them. I don't make much sense of it myself, but Redding believed that Nostradamus was referring here to the Philosopher's Stone, and that it would be discovered around some point in 2028, and subsequently misused for warfare. Now, the Philosopher's Stone isn't just what Voldemort was after so he could cheat death and regain his body. Ancient chemists, or alchemists, really did believe such a thing existed, in the form of a substance, and would attempt to engineer it under the belief that it would turn lesser materials into gold. If we were to discover such a substance today, well, the government probably wouldn't tell us about it. So we'd have no way of really verifying Nostradamus' quatrain, if interpreted in the same way as Reading. Reading implies here that regardless of its discovery, it will be misused in war, and based on that, you might say it could be used to create gold in an effort to fund wars, and possibly destabilize foreign economies. Perhaps you might go a step further, and say that such technology could be weaponized, and in the vein of King Midas, we might see some sort of weapon that turns people into gold. Okay, that sounds super far-fetched, but at least that idea is somewhat grounded when we consider the context. Reading, on the other hand, goes on to suggest in his summary of this section that Nostradamus might actually be referring to human cloning, and that in the year 2028, the first cloned human beings, almost akin to Spartans or actual clones in Star Wars, will be deployed into conventional warfare. The man from the east will leave his home and cross the Apennine Mountains to see France. He will pierce through the skies, the seas, and the snow. He will strike everyone with his staff. Reading takes us on a bit of a roundabout explanation here, though concedes even he isn't all that sure on this one. He suggests that the man from the east in his quatrain is actually the sun, or perhaps the personification of enlightenment. There is a sense here that for whatever reason, 2029 marks a period by which we suddenly wisen up to the world around us, and that the embodiment of this enlightenment strikes us with its staff. It basically knocks some sense into us. This implies that again, something happens to change our attitudes. There is a shift in the culture perhaps, and we start to view things a little differently, hopefully for the better. Personally, I hope it's the complete and utter rejection of AI, or at least generative AI, to be more specific. But I live and dream. 2029 is apparently going to be a busy one because Nostradamus has two predictions for us. The second is as follows. The sun is hidden, eclipsed by Mercury. It will take second place in the sky. Hermes will be eaten by Vulcan. The sun will be seen, pure, gleaming, and fair. Reading draws an interesting parallel between the size of Mercury and the possible prediction. In the quatrain, we see the sun is eclipsed by Mercury. Considering the size of little Mercury, which is smaller than the Earth and the nearest planet to the sun, it would not be capable of eclipsing the sun. Therefore, this can be seen as a metaphor that some smaller power is able to, at least temporarily, eclipse or overcome a much bigger power. I suppose you could read this as another invasion. Perhaps one seemingly smaller country invades another, or in the context of current world politics, maybe Ukraine is able to strike a significant blow against Russia. Reading suggests nothing of the like, but rather attributes the quatrain to scientific discovery, and that this quatrain is more like a warning. Essentially, he implies that we create something we don't necessarily have control over, and that whilst it might seem like we've eclipsed the sun with this invention, it pretty much all comes back to bite us. I was thinking something along the lines of a new nuclear weapon, but it could also be something more akin to virtual reality, where we create this sub-life akin to Ready Player One, and end up living most of our mortal existence through a machine. Perhaps something more in line with what we see in the Matrix, where we don't even realize we're plugged into something.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Hermes will be eaten by Vulcan, the words read, which Reading suggests becomes the symbol, in this context, of mankind's thirst for scientific discovery. Hermes is literally playing with fire, or Vulcan, being the blacksmith whose domain was fire, and so when the invention comes to fruition, and doesn't play out the way we intended, we are eaten by him. In essence, Nostradamus warns here that the price of progress might just be a tad too high. "2030, according to Nostradamus, shapes up to be, well, pretty crap to be honest. He starts off saying that the natural cycle of the planets will be broken by some force in the universe, hi Nibiru, and that this will cause the sun to not light the earth properly, thus causing a global famine. More than 11 times the moon will not want the sun, each augmenting and declining by degree, placed so low that little gold will be seen while sowing, so that after famine, the discovery of the secret will be lost. As we can see, there's a lot more to this than just a famine. Redding suggests it relates back to the 2028 discovery of the Philosopher's Stone, and that if such a thing is discovered, and used for ill purposes, it once again becomes lost. He adds in this summary of this section that between the years of 2028 and 2030, there is a brief hiatus in human ignorance. For some reason, we become aware of this Philosopher's Stone, which I still believe would be 100% kept from us if such a thing was discovered, but we lose access to it because of either a comet strike that destroys the technology or some kind of other natural disaster. 2031 is another year that Nostradamus remains quiet on in Redding's work, and so we can only assume that this is another rare good year. Remember, 2026 and 2031. Good years. Manifest it now. Don't make me come back to this video for humble pie. The subject of this part of the text is titled Political Correctness. Oh boy, where do I start with this one? At the risk of sounding like an alcoholic from Scotland, I'll say the pendulum of political correctness has swung a little too far in one direction. But according to Redding's interpretations, it's only going to get much worse. Redding tells us that the loss of our capacity to discriminate for fear of offending others will lead to the downfall of democracy, and that this will manifest in 2032 in totality. What's more, meat will be banned. Vegetarianism will be enforced through the common law. A time will come when meat gives way to fish. Communal law will go against the people. The old order will fight hard and then be ousted. The will of the people will be repulsed. It's hard to see this one coming to fruition. I mean, it's not like they're going to close McDonald's, right? Still, it's an interesting take from Redding, especially where he notes that the old order, that being us meat eaters, will resist the new law, but ultimately end up being forced to comply. It certainly gives 1984 vibes, where meat is one of the many things rationed in the totalitarian state. The second prediction of 2032 by Nostradamus involves the inevitable Antichrist, as per the biblical account in Revelation. The quatrain reads, "Though born in poverty, he will take supreme power. He will tyrannize and bankrupt his people, raising 1,000-year army. Though lucky, he costs lives and gold." This isn't to say that this Antichrist figure will reveal himself in this time, but rather this is the year he's born. However, it should also be noted that many people have been conflated and retrospectively assigned the title of Antichrist throughout history. Nero springs to mind, a Roman emperor who was known for his particular cruelty towards Christians, and whose violent reign was so potent that it effectively spawned generational trauma and paranoia that one day he was going to come back and pick up where he left off. Nostradamus himself proposed that the Antichrist would have also risen during the period that would become the Second World War, which many, including Redding, have theorized was in reference to Adolf Hitler. Of course, naming multiple instances of an Antichrist also came with the advantage of covering one's bases. If one person didn't fit one's definition of an Antichrist, another most certainly would. Something Nostradamus probably had the foresight to implement. So by this understanding, Nostradamus basically can't be wrong. You can always count on wicked men doing wicked things. And so in this instance, in about 20 to 30 years, we'll come to realize that some douchebag pushing the agenda of a world war was born around 2032, and thus people will say that Nostradamus predicted him. That being said, Nostradamus has a go at a second prediction of another Antichrist in 2032 as well. telling us, "Milk and the blood of frogs flows in Dalmatia. Battle is joined, there is a plague near Berlin. Wailing will echo throughout enslaved Slovenia, when the monster is born in and near Ravenna." Reading interprets that the specific places mentioned in this quatrain will be areas where calamity will strike, and that this will be the cause of the monster in the final line that is born near Ravenna. According to Reading, Dalmatia was an ancient city in modern-day Croatia. Berlin is believed to be Beleni in Romania. Slovenia is of course Slovenia, and Ravenna can be viewed as either Ravenna in Italy, a Ravna Reka in Serbia, or again Ravna Koraskem in Slovenia. Reading concludes that either the Antichrist will be born in one of these countries, or some terrible bad luck will transpire in these areas in 2032. Finally, it wouldn't be a complete 2032 without talking about the inevitable shit show that will be the US election.
They're eating the pets.
The great empire will continue year on year. One man will snatch it from the others. Both his life and his reign will be brief. He will only carry the load for 2 years. According to Reading, this is undoubtedly about the presidential election of America, that being the great empire that will continue to flourish. Yet going by the wording here, he determines that someone, possibly some wild card, will come up and steal it from right under the president's nose. It's unclear whether or not this is a Republican representative, a Democratic representative, or perhaps even a new third party that comes into the fold. Reading only cares to venture as far as to suggest that the current president at that time won't be getting another term. Yet this new player on the scene won't serve in the office that long. In fact, he won't even live that long. There's a suggestion here that he will be assassinated halfway through his term, or that he is either usurped or steps down. Another possibility is that the president passes away from natural causes or old age, which makes me wonder if there could be some potential return for trickery will reign, the army will be stripped, an obsession with class, spying given free rein, false friends will unite, hatred once quiescent will be reawakened. Reading tells us here that by the year 2033, the effects of class warfare will be fully actualized, but that it will be repackaged under the guise of social inclusion, perhaps a result of the previous year's heightened political correctness. In this reality, Reading interprets that the army will be stripped of its power through some fraud or trickery, and that this would result in the act of state tyranny becoming more and more likely. In this year, fake friends will band together under the shared notion of hatred, perhaps a formed allegiance between two or more world leaders who would benefit from the destruction of a particular people or country. Some say the lines and teams for such a reality are already being formed as we speak. Reading calls back to Germany under Hitler, Spain under Franco, or France under Pétain. All these regimes were obsessed with class too, and though they purported to govern based in the best interests of the people, they were actually self-serving their own agendas, or introducing their own forms of plutocracy. In his conclusion, Reading explains that politicians will simply have too much power. A new wave of political correctness strikes again in 2034, just 2 years after the first new wave of enforced vegetarianism. By this point in time, we not only lose meat, but we also lose alcohol. Indeed, a new prohibition is enforced, and ironically, the country hit most significantly by this is France. Wine, once a staple of French cuisine, is thrown out of the window, and in the words of Reading, is replaced with fish and fish only. The French nation will be consumed by regret. With a frivolous heart, they trusted to rashness. Bread, salt, no wine, water, poison, not beer. Their leader made captive. Hunger, cold, and want ensue. We mentioned in the previous section of advanced political correctness that there would be an old guard consisting of the people who rejected these changes. The last line of this quatrain relates to them, according to Redding, or rather relates to their leader, who though also opposed these changes, is ultimately imprisoned, seeing to the eventual decline of those who resist, and perhaps their eventual acceptance of this new way of life. As is the case in 2033, Redding stresses on the point that politicians will come to have too much power, almost akin to the totalitarian party of Orwell's 1984, and that they will come to abuse said power with unprecedented rules and regulations. Whilst France is used as the prime example here, being specifically mentioned by Nostradamus, it is likely that this trend would spread to other European countries too. Yet France appears to be the epicenter of much of this controversy. Nostradamus continues of France in 2034. The senseless anger of the furious war will cause brothers to unsheathe their knives across the table. Driven apart, wounded, prying, the pride-driven duel will hurt France. Redding tells us that there will be a civil unrest in France, with some falling in line with the new European superstate laws and others continuing to resist. This would manifest in a civil war, and perhaps the shadow of a revolution, where brother will strike brother with knives across the table. Redding implies that there will be a great fight between the two sides, those who are in favour of the new government regime and those who long for the old ways. According to Nostradamus, 2034 also sees the birth of yet another Antichrist on the day of a total eclipse, said to be transpiring on 20th of March, which Redding tells us is a little ahead of the sun's transit from Pisces into Aries, the sign of wars, famines, heat, droughts, and magical transformation. At the total eclipse of the sun, the monster will be seen in broad daylight. He will be misinterpreted. None will have foreseen the great cost. Redding tells us that the eclipse will pass over Central Africa, the Middle East, including Egypt and Iran, and Asia, including India and China. Here in one of these areas will the Antichrist be conceived and be born. Just as before, Redding is basing this on the word monster from this quatrain, and that his coming will be welcomed by many, perhaps even praised, but that ultimately his existence will portend disaster. That's interesting because, as we know from both biblical and Quranic narratives, there will come forth an individual claiming to be God, and who will demonstrate many great and magnificent things to convince the masses that he is who he says he is. Many will apparently be deceived by this character, which seems to be exactly the case in Nostradamus' prediction, in that the Antichrist will be misinterpreted and none will have foreseen the great cost. Redding concludes, the third Antichrist is conceived in 2034 in darkness, during the total eclipse. He will be born into darkness too, and he will bring darkness upon the world. At the entrance to the Garonne and Baza, and the forest close to Damazon, Mont de Marsan is frozen, then hail and northerly winds. Dordogne freezes, but in the wrong house. Nostradamus is pretty specific in this quatrain that the area south of the bank of the river Garonne will be struck with an unsuspecting case of particularly bad weather. The Dordogne mentioned in the final line, situated 60 miles to the north, is renowned for its abominable winter weather, according to Redding, with temperatures reaching as low as -15 degrees Celsius. Nostradamus is therefore implying that this time, in this particular winter season, the usual freeze will happen in a more unexpected place. Redding concludes that it will catch the people living here catastrophically unprepared. Yet another Antichrist is delivered to us in 2035, according to Nostradamus, this one being born in a western part of Europe. From deep in the western part of Europe, a child will be born to poor parents. He will seduce the multitude with his tongue. The noise of his reputation will grow in the Eastern Kingdom. Redding's interpretation of this quatrain is quite bold. He suggests without any real explanation that this Antichrist born in Western Europe will be a Muslim and will lead Muslims on a global scale by the time he is in his mid-30s, sometime around 2070. He will resurrect or establish an equivalent of the Ottoman Empire through the merely seductive power of his language, and will become such a prominent figure that his influence and composure is enough to threaten both the US and China. Worse still, Redding suggests that there will be a massive nuclear war in 2070 that is instigated by this individual, one that is powerful enough to disturb mountains. Redding emphasizes the slippery nature of this man, whose charming nature is so deceptive that he will be remembered as a great manipulator and fixer. In what is perhaps one of the more bleak and haunting predictions, Redding writes, "The third Antichrist is born. The die has been cast. The future of the world, unless a miracle occurs, will be very bleak, with global warfare and ecological damage on an unprecedented scale." A great king falls into the hands of a youngster. There is confusion around Easter time, and a knife blow, long-term captives, and St. Elmo's fire, when three brothers wound and kill each other. Once again, Redding interprets this quatrain as pertaining to the Antichrist, specifically the previous individual who was born to poor parents and raised as a Muslim. Unfortunately, he is once again quite arbitrary in how he makes this connection. He discusses the imagery of St. Elmo's fire, acknowledging that Nostradamus is fond of this particular weather phenomena, as well as the use of three brothers, which Nostradamus also uses to symbolize certain motifs, yet doesn't really give us anything concrete. He claims it's instinctive to connect this quatrain with the previous one, and that this is Nostradamus' second warning to us of the Antichrist, and that he will successfully confuse the masses around the meaning and history of Easter. Redding then makes the claim that the third Antichrist will be confused with the second coming of Christ, as foretold in various religious works, and that he will damage both the world and the Christian church. If we go with Redding's instincts and entertain the idea that this Antichrist is a Muslim with incredible influence and infinite charm, then it's reasonable to believe that he would declare Islam the one true religion, under the guise of being Jesus returned, and convince a large portion of the world to give up Christianity and convert. Shortly before the eclipse of the sun, a war is triggered by a great nation of unbelievers. Wastefully, the seaport does not fight back. Bridge and memorial are disserviced. So remember that eclipse in 2034 that signified the birth of one of many antichrists that Nostradamus predicted? Yeah, turns out there's another eclipse in 2037, but at least this one doesn't herald the birth of an evildoer. Instead, Redding interprets the quatrain as Australia, being a nation of unbelievers considering their secular stance, starting a war with Indonesia over supremacy in the Indian Ocean. Redding uses the seaport, the bridge, the memorial as clues that represent Surabaya, the second largest city and seaport in Indonesia after Jakarta. Surabaya's largest monument also happens to be a memorial to those who died during Indonesia's struggle for independence in the 1940s, known as Tugu Pahlawan. So with these factors, Redding is convinced that Nostradamus was referring here to a conflict between these two nations, which starts off as armed skirmishes but quickly proceeds into all-out war. After everything we've seen predicted for the next 10 years, you'll probably be relieved to learn that Nostradamus has nothing in store for us in 2038. Although at this point we're probably getting ready for GTA 7, and the new Last of Us super duper scrotum scratching remaster remake edition. By 2039, you'll be remiss to learn that the more things change, the more they stay the same, at least between the Greeks and the Turks. Conflict is re-escalated once again over the land between the two countries, with Redding suggesting some enlightened pragmatism may be in order to accommodate Turkey as they enter the EU around this point. According to Redding, Greece would be required under EU law to cede the likes of Rhodes, Kos and Samos in order to solidify the bigger picture, something that Greece would be adamantly against. "2040 sees the arrival of two great storms. The first of these storms is so out of left field that no one sees it coming, with the effects being catastrophic. However, as if this wasn't bad enough, another storm shows up in the aftermath and wreaks even more havoc." Redding tells us that communities will be taken by surprise, and that the existing damage of the first storm will be compounded. A short while after a previous occurrence, a further fierce storm will rise over land and sea. The seaborne cost of this one will be even larger. Fire, animals. It will be an even greater outrage. Meanwhile, a different kind of storm rages in Britain, where, at long last, the monarchy is toppled. And these jokers have to go back to being common people. The young man born to rule Britain, though commanded by his dying father. Once the father is dead, London will cavil, and the kingdom will be taken back from his son. Now, to be fair, Nostradamus, according to Redding's interpretations, did say Charles would abdicate the throne in favour of his son William back in 2022. This obviously didn't happen, which is a prime example as to why we shouldn't take anything that either one of these guys has to say too seriously, but allow us to indulge them nonetheless for the purposes of this video. Redding does explain in his analysis that this particular quatrain is quite difficult to make sense of, so perhaps he'd have used that as his disclaimer in the event that it didn't come to fruition. Here, a young man born to rule Britain is commanded by his dying father to take over. My initial thoughts about this was that the dying father was King Charles, who'd be about 92 years old at this point, and the young man born to rule was Prince William, who'd be about 58 years old. However, Redding suggests that by this point, William will already be king, and that he is the dying father, who is passing on the crown to his son Prince George, who at this point would be 27 years old. Despite commanding the nation to follow his son, and recognize him as the new monarch, as the quatrain details, London outright rejects him and decides they've had enough of the royal family altogether. As per Redding's interpretations, by this point in the future, there is no illusion that politicians hold all the power anyway, so it's reasonable that the crown's relevance further diminishes in the age of governmental authority. Nostradamus further continues, "The castles of the besieged will be locked. They will fall because of gunpowder. The traitors will be imprisoned alive. Never before have the Saxons been so piteously divided." Redding believes that this is most certainly a continuation from the prediction of the fall of the monarchy. He believes the clues lie in Nostradamus' wording, specifically in the first line containing the castles. As we know, the royal family owns several castles, or at least notable buildings, including Windsor, Buckingham Palace, Balmoral, etc., and so it's under Redding's belief that these buildings will be seized and annexed, either by our new totalitarian overlords or by the common man, who rises up and takes it by force.
Whose streets? Our streets. Whose streets?
Perhaps more interesting is the use of the word gunpowder, and how this fall will transpire because of it, almost a nod to the gunpowder plot of 1605, which aimed to bring down the royal power under King James I. Nostradamus was a monarchist himself, so this wasn't wishful thinking on his behalf. There is a suggestion here that those that support, or who are responsible for the decline of the monarchy, are traitors and will be imprisoned, giving us the idea that whilst the new totalitarian government benefit from the removal of the monarchy and allow it to transpire, they maintain an authoritative stance and both condemn and reprimand the dissenters, which according to the previous quatrain is all of London. Redding adds that the British will come to realise that in getting rid of their monarchy, they have made a grievous mistake, and that divisions will increase rather than diminish as a result. He notes Britain will lose the cement that bound it together as a nation. Nostradamus continues, royal blood will be diluted. France will be gagged by the Americans. Some time will need to pass, until the memory of all that was said passes away. Here, Redding suggests that the dilution of royal blood is a result of a possible birth out of wedlock, which throws the British succession into disarray. Therefore, not only is the new King George rejected by England, but there arises doubts over his heritage too. Here, Redding suggests that the French will get involved here for some reason, and lead the charge in favour of this bastard child, who according to the European Constitution would have exactly the same rights as a child born inside a regularised marriage, something that doesn't really work for the British royal protocol. There's literally no reason for France to be involved in this scandal, nor is there any reason for the French to be gagged by the Americans as Redding interprets, because they don't really have a stake in any of this. He suggests that the schism between England and France becomes so deep over this matter that America has to get involved and play as peacemaker. Born inside the shadows on the very day of an eclipse, he will be sovereign in rule and goodness. He will renew his blood at the ancient urn, restoring the golden age with bronze. Despite eclipses normally symbolizing the birth of an Antichrist, Redding interprets this one a little differently. Indeed, this eclipse is believed by him to cover Angola, the Congo, Uganda, Kenya, and Somalia, and signifies the birth of a Pan-African leader who will unite the traditionally disparate tribes and countries. Redding justifies this conclusion by use of the ancient urn in line 3, remarking that Africa, in particular, the geographic areas comprising of Kenya and Tanzania, was likely the cradle of human life. The use of bronze in line 4 also suggests a return to the simpler ways of the past, because as bronze is one of the earliest known alloys, it implies that this African leader will revert to a more Bronze Age style, seeing his people reject modern technology, or at least a new technological advancement, and therefore avoid its many pitfalls. Redding describes this as one of the more optimistic interpretations, seeing as how dark and desolate every other prediction is, and that with this leader, Africa might hold itself apart from the world's conflicts, and present itself as a place of renewal and stability. Redding has no notes on the year 2042, and so we'll go ahead and assume that nothing too terrible happens and everything is fine. It's just as well if 2042 is uneventful, because by 2043, the world appears to change forever in what appears to be the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in modern human existence, the beginning of the religious wars. Weapons of war will scream in the sky. That same year, even holy men will become enemies. They will unfairly attempt to suppress sacred law. True believers will die by war and shock. Redding takes most of the words literally in this quatrain, though ponders on the term sacred law in line 3. Here he considers whether this could be related to either the Ten Commandments or to the sacred law in Islam, Sharia law. According to Redding, it could very well be a conflict between the disparate schools of Islam seeking to oppress and suppress the other's teachings, which could then spark a war. We spoke earlier about the differences of Muslim belief, specifically between the Sunni and Shia, which Redding once again points to as being the cause of this contention. Redding further concludes we could be facing another war between Iran and Iraq, on a scale much larger than the previous war between them, that lasted for 8 years between 1980 and 1988. Yet another prediction for this great war in 2043 reads, "When the shooting star appears, the 3 great princes will fall out. World peace will falter, struck from the sky. both Tiber and Po will overflow, and a serpent will be placed on their banks. According to Redding, America, Russia, China, and other world leaders will disagree over which side to support and how best to deal with the conflict between Iran and Iraq. Yet it is not all bleak, even with the final line mentioning a serpent seated at the banks of the river Tiber and the river Po. Despite the Christian imagery of the serpent representing Satan, serpents can also represent regeneration and regrowth, as seen in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the snake is able to steal the plant of eternal youth and gain the ability to shed its skin, thus living anew. Therefore, Redding comes to the conclusion that whilst world leaders disagree over how to manage the conflict, the schism is, at least temporarily, repaired. This religious war is made all the more menacing by the almost convenient breakthrough in chemical warfare technology that is said to transpire around the same time. Though Redding argues the following quatrain ought to be taken metaphorically as much as it is taken literally, he does go to some lengths to attribute it as a disastrous discovery, and that the genie must not be let out of the bottle when it comes to this advancement in chemical understanding. A rainbow will appear by night near Nantes. Seafaring men will call up artificial rain. A great fleet will be fused in the Arabian Gulf. In Saxony, a monster will be born of a bear and a sow. Here Redding attributes the rainbow to the Greek goddess Iris, also a messenger of the gods, who portended discord. Supposedly, strife will indeed strike around the city of Nantes, France, because Redding describes it as a major port and a manufacturing centre of chemicals, perhaps where this chemical breakthrough occurs. It doesn't talk too much about the meaning of artificial rain in line 2, but merely suggests that this is a result of having created this controversial technology, that suddenly man gains the ability to create rain, or create some means to rain down chemicals upon specific areas. He also mentions Saxony, which Redding attributes to Germany on account of it being the site of an ancient region of northwestern Europe, where Charlemagne imposed Christianity. The bear who gives birth to some monster in this region is believed by Redding to be Russia, but he makes no effort to identify the sow, whom the bear mates with, but rather implies the sow is either an empty vessel or some kind of domesticated partner, perhaps some kind of apparatus by which the bear, or Russia, uses to create the aforementioned technology. How heaven mourns the birth of the hermaphrodite. Near to heaven, human blood is shed. Too late, through death, a great people are recreated. Help comes both too early and too late. Redding further struggles to find a concrete meaning behind this quatrain, but implies that the prediction of the previous quatrain of chemical warfare is echoed here. The first line mentions the birth of the hermaphrodite being of great disappointment to the heavens, and we might need to lean into Greek mythology to really get at what Nostradamus meant here. Hermaphroditus was the son of Hermes and Aphrodite, and was considered to be a very handsome man. In fact, he was so handsome that the nymph Salmacis fell deeply in love with him, and pleaded with the gods to have them end up together. The gods, with their twisted sense of humour, did exactly that. But instead of having them enter into a relationship that Salmacis intended, they actually merged them together into one being. With this in mind, we can't help but think of the modern controversies around gender that happen these days, and wonder if perhaps these concerns and arguments follow us well into the future. Redding suggests that this line is more reflective of Nostradamus' attitude, and the attitude of the people of the 16th century, who would have viewed the birth of a hermaphrodite, or the belief that one ought to have had a non-traditional gender, as unnatural, which is why they'd be in mourning to witness it. Yet Redding also attempts to link this with the previous quatrain, suggesting that the artificial rain, or the chemical rain potentially created by the Russians, will actually have side effects in either creating hermaphrodites or causing defects in children who are born in the area, similar to the children born with defects after the detonation of the atomic bomb over Nagasaki and Hiroshima. In 2046, Redding interprets Nostradamus' words in a rather convoluted and ambivalent fashion. He fixates on this sense of renewal in the second line, but instead of decrying any specific prediction, rather describes it as Dionysiac and leaves it as that. Following one great human tragedy, a greater lies in wait. The mighty movement of the centuries brings renewal. Rain, blood, milk, famine, sword, and the plague. Fire will be seen in the sky with a trail of sparks. He ignores the rather vivid imagery of rain, blood, famine, sword, and plague, and instead turns to talking about the human tendency to view the arrival of comets, meteors, and asteroids as harbingers of change and precursors to apocalyptic events. He implies that during this time, there will be a great superstition amongst people, who after seeing so many disasters in the world, start trying to predict the events, in a vein similar to Nostradamus himself. He concludes, there will be a restlessness throughout the earth as people prepare, intuitively, for the coming of a great catastrophe. Signs will be sought and auguries looked for. Funny that Redding mentions meteors as being harbingers of change, because in that same year, there will be a global catastrophe, possibly a meteor strike. In the vicinity of Auch, Lector, and Miranda, a great fire will fall from the sky for 3 nights. A stupendous, well-aimed and spectacular occurrence. Soon afterwards, the earth will tremble and be ruffled. A great fire falling from the sky effectively sounds very much like a meteor strike, and most might be tempted to take it literally. However, biblical readers might also associate it with the burning sulfur that rains down upon Sodom and Gomorrah, incinerating it. The biblical interpretation would lead us to believe that sinners specifically, of which the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were said to have been teeming with, would be destroyed. But the great fire that falls from the sky in Nostradamus' quatrain is much more indiscriminate. The implication here is that there will be fire, possibly meteor strikes, that fall upon the earth for 3 nights, and that nobody will be safe. However, Redding also points out some bias in this quatrain, specifically Nostradamus' mention of Auch, Lector, and Miranda, where the meteor strikes are most impactful. It was in and around these places that not only did his wife die, but their 2 children also fell to the plague. Naturally, these areas were a source of pain for him, so it would come as no surprise that he predicted a fate for these places that were equally as terrible as his own. Lake Trasimeno will show that the conspirators are to be found in Perugia. A despot will imitate a sage, killing the German through the breastbone and face. Redding tells us here that this is a mafia-related killing that transpires in 2047 at Lake Trasimeno. According to Redding, the mafia are still a powerful force in southern Italy, something that Nostradamus apparently knew had come to power as early as the 13th century. This 2047 murder is described as being very high profile and features the killing of a German man. It also sees the mafia boss having a field day in court, and that he becomes a global figure as a result of being publicity hungry. A second killing related to the first also occurs in 2047, with Redding telling us, oaths will be taken on Lake Lemon. Days will become weeks, then months, then a year. All will default. Magistrates will curse their useless laws. He concludes of this prediction that Interpol are powerless to solve the case as a result of the mafia's influence, to the point that the murder of the 2 men in question is never actually solved. The scorching of the wide, fertile plains of Bordeaux will produce so many gadflies and locusts that sunlight will become opaque. they will devour everything, bringing a terrible plague. In this quatrain, Redding tells us that the wild fertile plains in line 1 hint toward the distinction between the surplus of Europe and the relative poverty of the African savanna. Things are set to change, however, because of global warming. Indeed, according to Redding, this whole quatrain is about climate change, and that those very dry winds that are expected on the desert plains will soon rampage their way through Europe if we are not careful. On the topic of geography, we are also told in 2048 that 2 twin hurricanes will decimate an area on the US Atlantic coast. The great maritime ocean city, surrounded by salt marshes, in both the winter solstice and the spring, will be tormented by a frightful wind. Despite the flare-ups of disgruntlement we are currently seeing regarding the state of immigration, Redding tells us that it will still be a hot topic in 2049, especially for France. According to his analysis, France, a secular state, has become challenged by the ever-increasing pressure of immigration, specifically those who demand to be judged not by the laws of the country who has adopted them, but by the laws of the country they have left behind. Supposedly, Nostradamus was aware that such a thing would transpire, and intended for the following quatrain to be a warning to his people. French state, you will be changed. Your realm will be modified in singular ways. Rouen will be eaten by other laws and customs. Chartres will be even worse. Redding concludes that Nostradamus believed that the state's views were more essential than the views of the individual, and that should his government have bent the knee to foreign customs and allowed foreign law to take over, he wouldn't have been very pleased about it. What's more, Redding specifically states that uncontrolled immigration would come to impact the traditions of the French way of life, suggesting that various areas in France would essentially no longer be controlled by original French law. Naturally, Nostradamus used France as his primary focus, considering he was a Frenchman. But considering France had much more global relevance in the 16th century, you might say that many of these predictions are now applicable to other European countries too. Indeed, most Western European countries appear to be dealing with some form of immigration crisis, whether it's genuine asylum seekers fleeing war-torn countries or illegal entrants escaping their own country's jurisdiction. The boat crisis in the UK is a prime example of the sort of thing Nostradamus was supposedly warning France about. And so it's scary to think that if it's bad now, then by 2049 it only gets so much worse. Redding gives us no details on 2050, so once more, we'll have to not look a gift horse in the mouth and just assume that nothing bad happens here. They will unite against the red sex. The peace will be undermined by fire, water, and iron. The plotters will die by the sword, except one whom the people will destroy. In this quatrain, Redding interprets Nostradamus' words by telling us that the colour red is the colour of magic, a deduction he doesn't elaborate on. He also associates red to war in Roman times, as well as the colour of the flag hoisted by the navy to declare no quarter. What's more, red, he determines, was the symbol of insurrection and terrorism in 1791 France. From this, he predicts that there will be some effort to combat terrorism on a global scale, and something of a war on terror part 2. In fact, he gets quite specific in this interpretation, specifying that all terrorists involved in a mid-century plot will die by the sword, thus perhaps killing themselves in an effort to become martyrs. He specifies, these terrorists consider themselves martyrs, and are prepared to die for their cause, all save one, whom the crowd dispatch before he is able to trigger the explosives he is carrying on his person. In 2052, Redding believes Nostradamus was warning us of a battle of the sexes. A city obsessed by walls between the sexes finds the enemy outside, and its chief priest prepare to surrender, the wind will fan the sparks. They will be driven off by heat, dust, and cinders. There is no indication from the text as to which exact nation will experience this tension between men and women, but Redding once again believes it pertains to a Muslim city operated by the Taliban, and Taliban priests specifically. Perhaps a nod to Afghanistan? He refers to a place where men and women are rigorously separated, but that becomes besieged by pro-Western forces seeking to liberate the oppressed. This then spearheads the downfall of this ruling priestly class operating in the city, and that this enables the liberalization of certain religious laws, including the emancipation of women who are otherwise burdened by such jurisdiction. This battle of the sexes continues into 2053, with Nostradamus writing, "The laws of the sun and of Venus will clash, appropriating the spirit of prophecy. Neither the one nor the other will be heard. The great Messiah's law will prevail through the sun." Through this, Redding interprets that there will be a clash between men and women, men being represented by Apollo, the sun, in the first line of the quatrain, whilst women are represented by Venus, goddess of love. He then tells us the characteristics of these respective gods, with Apollo being encouraging of fair play, moral excellence and forbearance, and Venus encouraging courtship, chastity and protection. Therefore, Redding comes to the conclusion that this is in reference to an over-feminization of culture that will come to stunt the growth of society. Once again, Redding believes that Nostradamus suggests some sort of activity on behalf of the prophesied Antichrist in 2054, one who he comes to associate with the Emperor Nero. As aforementioned, Nero was indeed once considered to have been the Antichrist, and because ancient Romans would have come to have feared this diabolical reign so much, there came to be much superstition and anxiety about him one day returning. Nero is specifically mentioned in this quatrain. The young Nero, using 3 chimneys, will burn the living world in his ardour. Happy the person far from such practices. 3 of his own blood will watch him die. Redding tells us of the legendary account of Nero watching Rome burn. According to some historians, he was noted as having ignited the fire himself so as to make way for the building of a shiny new palace, whilst also choosing this opportune moment to play his lyre, as the city and its people were incinerated. Redding states that he had forbidden the fires to be extinguished because he wanted to see what the whole thing would look like when it was covered in flames, regardless of the devastation and loss of life that would come as a result of it. Yet Redding also tells us that this quatrain does not necessarily relate to the Roman Emperor Nero, but the use of Nero here can also be used as a generic term to describe someone bloody-minded or violent. Therefore, this could actually be pointing toward one of the modern-day Antichrists that he's spoken of before, or perhaps the initial stage of one of their lives. For instance, the quatrain contains a young Nero with his 3 chimneys, which Redding suggests could later warrant a mature Nero, who burns the living world, followed by a dead Nero, who is eventually killed by his own blood, perhaps those who are even worse than he is. Yet despite this attempt to showcase whoever this Nero is, Redding boils the entire quatrain down to censorship and book burning, rather than a literal burning of the world. He concludes that this would-be Antichrist is building his power base by playing on his followers' greed for power over others, akin to Hitler manipulating his followers with political favours. Foreigners far from Rome, their great city will be damaged by rainfall. A girl from not that far away is taken by their leader, her old bonds still in place. Yet again, Redding comes to the conclusion that the foreigners far from home are Muslims. There's absolutely no basis for this as far as I can see, and Redding makes no effort to try and justify it, other than suggesting that the furthest thing from Roman Catholicism is Islam, so therefore it must be pertaining to Muslims, not, I don't know, Atheists who don't even believe in God? In any case, his interpretation predicts that a great Muslim city is devastated by torrential rainfall, another nod to climate change. Redding admits that the girl in this quatrain is much harder to determine, and may very well be a symbolic reference to general loss of freedom, but he still puts forward an idea that the girl could be representative of Muslim womanhood, and that these old bonds that are still in place are representative of restrictions that traditional Muslim women face. 2054 also sees a standoff between the US and China, where we are told, two revolutions, thanks to the cunning scythe-bearer. Kingdoms will alter in the new century. Libra will move into its house, and both sides are well balanced. Once more, Redding proves to be painfully vague in his predictions here, choosing not to explain exactly where America and China fit into this quatrain. Instead, he rattles on about astrology and the characteristics of the various planets during the month of Libra, between 22nd of September and 22nd of October. The scythe-bearer in this quatrain he conflates with the planet Saturn, as well as the mythological equivalent who comes to consume his own children. From this he concludes, China and the United States are now equally powerful and equally influential on the world stage. A treaty is agreed, diffusing potential areas of conflict. There is a temporary standoff. The relationship between the US and China continues as tensely as it ever was in 2055. Redding describes the pact established in the previous year as fragile, whilst he also interprets Nostradamus' words to imply that this is an unfortunate wedding, suggesting that neither party wants such consolidation, but must maintain it for the sake of peace. They will celebrate the unfortunate wedding with great joy, but it will have an unhappy end. Husband and mother will scorn the new bride. With Phoebus dead, the North has an even worse fate. The mention of Phoebus, the sun god, dying in the final line also implies that the world will be met with darkness in the wake of this wedding, perhaps a result of this wedding between America and China that will end unhappily. By 2055, there appears to be a Cold War well underway between America and China, and so whatever wedding Nostradamus refers to is by this point beginning to crumble. Naturally, as I've come to expect by this point, nothing in these quatrains can be really attributed to the US or China, but Redding seems adamant that this is the case. In the reverse of a Babylonian climate, there will be much bloodshed. Land, sea, air, and heaven will be iniquitous. Sects, hunger, new kingdoms, plagues and confusion follow. In his analysis, Redding tells us that the world will teeter on the brink of a global war, but that it won't come to full fruition until 2070. He attempts to make some sense of the reverse of a Babylonian climate, suggesting that the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon are being inferred here. These gardens, believed to be one of the 7 wonders of the world in Hellenic culture, were believed to be supported by pillars that saw them soaring well over 300 feet in the air. By suggesting a reverse Babylon, it implies that the spectacle is not raised into the air, but buried underground, giving us the idea that death is on the cards. There will be much bloodshed, Nostradamus states. What's interesting is that despite the quatrain not containing anything about Islam, and despite not really even mentioning Islam in his analysis, Redding still titles the subject of this chapter Islam Disturbs the Balance of World Power, which just isn't exemplified in this passage. He continues this trend in the subsequent chapter, also pertaining to the year 2055, telling us the horrible war being prepared in the West will be followed the next year by a plague so terrible in its effect that it spares not young, old, nor animal. Blood, fire, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter in France. Redding titles this quatrain Islam Disturbs the Balance of World Power too, but yet again makes no convincing argument that it pertains to Islam at all. The only time he does mention Islam is in his explanations to establish it as the opposite of Christianity. According to Redding, Islam strikes again in Islam Disturbs the Balance of World Power 3. He tells us, "You will see, sooner or later, great changes occurring, extreme horrors and vengeances, as if the moon, led by its angels, approaches heaven and its inclinations." Immediately, Redding fixates on the use of the angel in line 3, noting that in Jewish belief, the angel Gabriel is the angel of death, whilst in Islam, he is the angel of truth. I'm not sure where he's getting this from. I've always seen Gabriel as a messenger angel. In the Bible, Gabriel explains the meaning of visions to Daniel. He delivers news to Zechariah that his wife will give birth, and he announces the coming birth of Jesus to Mary. Meanwhile, in Islam, as Jibreel, he's seen to deliver the word of the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad. Nowhere, at least theologically speaking, is Gabriel associated with death. I can't agree with Redding that Gabriel represents death in any capacity, so already for me, his interpretation of this quatrain is skewered. Redding further attempts to elaborate by talking about events in the Quran, describing the moment where Muhammad carves a mountain in two. This then becomes symbolic for Redding, who puts forth that the Islamic world is now splitting the balance of world power in two, with China on one side and America on the other. How on earth Islam is responsible for this divide in two countries that aren't even Islamic is beyond me. Honestly, it does start to feel as if Redding attempts to bend Nostradamus' words in order to vilify Islam in these sorts of quatrains, because he not only pulls things out of thin air, but he tries to shoehorn them into spaces where they clearly do not fit. His predictions for 2056 continue with remarks towards several crises within the Roman Catholic Church. What plague and sword could not finish, dies at the wellhead, struck from the sky. The abbot will die when he sees the ruin of those lost overboard, trying in vain to reclimb the ladders. Redding believes that the death mentioned in the second line of the quatrain is in reference to a crisis that occurs from within the church, and that many of the church's teachings will be underpinned. Once this happens, the church as a whole will begin to lose its influence, and there is a general loss of faith. Redding describes the church in this age as a ship without a crew, and possibly without a captain, which pertains to the next quatrain where the Pope dies. On the death of the very old Pope, a Roman in the prime of life will succeed him. It will be said that he weakens the pontificate, that he will last long and cause acute damage. Once more, Redding gets into specifics that he doesn't provide evidence for, telling us that the dead Pope is succeeded by a much younger Pope, who is Italian and born in Rome. There is fear amongst the congregation because of how young this new Pope is, for it is believed that he will introduce new modern ideas that have not otherwise been congruent with traditional Catholic beliefs. However, Redding claims that there is no need to fear, because this Pope will die within the year of his election. The new Pope is believed to attempt to cement his power too early, and as a result, he starts rubbing people up the wrong way. In fact, Redding tells us in his conclusion that the cardinals start to think they have made a grave error in electing him in the first place. Furthermore, in his analysis, Redding assumes to know Nostradamus' attitude towards this new future Pope, who he wished was consigned to hell, where the devil would give him a warm and possibly even infernal welcome. In the fourth prediction regarding this crisis within the church, it leads Redding to believe that this new Pope changes so many aspects of Catholic tradition that he can't manage the implications that arise as a result of them. Additionally, the faithful, even the nuns, find themselves disillusioned with this new way of life and find themselves being undermined. The raised one will not recognize his own scepter. The children of the Great One are disgraced. Never was there a fouler, crueler being. The Black One will banish their dead spouses. In a final prediction regarding the church under this newfound modern regime, we are told, before the battle can be joined, the great wall falls. The mighty one is dead, dead before his time, complaining, born imperfect, Most will now swim. Near the river, the ground is the colour of blood. As aforementioned, this new radical pope doesn't last very long and dies within the same year of his enthronement. Redding suggests in his conclusion that his death may have come about through sinister means, but that it is ultimately justified because it reverts the church back into a more sustainable house. Nothing is written in 2058, so we'll assume that this is just a rare good year in a sea of violence and corruption. Two will be besieged with burning fervour. 2 full cups will not quench their thirst. The strong are finished, and an old dreamer will show the Genevans the way to nearer. Redding goes on a tangent regarding the original Old French in which the quatrain was written, and through some circumstantial, sometimes often random reasoning, he tells us that on the 2nd of February 2059, there will be a crisis in the Protestant Church. Here he notes that an elderly spiritual guide will point adherents of the old church towards Buddhism, or a Buddhist-like religion. Effectively, the Protestant Church loses its direction and ends up evolving into something more resembling of the old Gnostic beliefs. The 2060 interpretation from Redding is a perfect example of him being completely off the mark. The quatrain reads, "First in France, now in Romania, by sea and land to the English in Paris, marvellous deeds by that great alliance, the violent attack will lose the northern larch." This, Redding believed, was the date that the United Kingdom would finally withdraw from the EU, which he acknowledges was voted for in 2016. However, it didn't take 44 years to achieve, but actually just 4 years, being officially completed in January of 2020. Now, some readers might say that whilst he was incorrect about the dates, he was still correct about the actual event transpiring. But it should be remembered that Redding was obviously aware that the British had voted to leave the EU, so it was fundamentally always going to happen, even if it didn't seem like it at the time. Therefore, you might counter-argue that Redding was merely predicting the inevitable, but rather overcompensated for how long it would take to achieve. Perhaps more impressive is that Nostradamus had written these words, but again, we must remember that they are only given meaning by the one doing the interpreting. 2060 also sees a conflict between Serbia and Croatia, which Redding notes echoes the last conflict in the years of 1991 to 1995. Yet again, Redding believes that Islam is the cause of this conflict, noting that both countries have a significant Muslim minority, and that they are the ones who trigger this violent engagement. A Barbary conflict in the Black Gutter. Blood will be spilled, rocking Dalmatia. Great Ishmael will create inroads in the trembling ranks of the Portuguese rescuers. Redding draws his conclusion primarily from the use of Ishmael being mentioned in line 3, noting that Ishmael is sent away, along with his mother Hagar, by Abraham in the Bible, and that in the desert, Ishmael goes on to become the progenitor of 12 nomad tribes and effectively an ancestor of the Prophet Muhammad. The old man is mocked and unseated by the same foreigner who bribed him. He will see the hands of his son eaten in front of him. He will betray his brother at Chartres, at Orleans, and at Rouen. In 2061, Redding interprets Nostradamus' words as a betrayal taking place, specifically against the French president, whom he believed was a trusted advisor. The betrayal cuts so deep that the effects are even felt by the president's son, at least in a political manner, whereby the son's name is tarnished so badly that he is banished from the government altogether.
He's going to be a great president of France. That's my prediction. It's only a prediction.
Redding comes to this conclusion because he believed hands were a symbol of power in ancient Egypt, and so for hands to be eaten like this in this quatrain, it would be symbolic of one having their power completely diminished. As Chartres, Orleans and Rouen are all French cities, it is likely that this prediction is intended for France. 2061 also sees the beginning of an Arab war, where we are told that a Western army invades an Arab territory. Naturally, the Arabs don't take too kindly to this, and so a war erupts. The quatrain reads, "The great army of the people of the cross will draw up in Mesopotamia. A smaller company from a nearby river will find their rule inimical." Here, Redding interprets the people of the cross as Christians who invade Mesopotamia, now modern-day Iraq, and are not made welcome. You'll find that in this quatrain, it doesn't necessarily say anything about war. In fact, it looks as if the Christian invasion is successful, if not for a smaller company that resists them. Mabus, though dead, returns. Both man and beast suffer terribly. Then, all of a sudden, vengeance arrives. Much blood, thirst, hunger when the comet passes. According to Redding, Mabus in line 1 of this quatrain is one of the most contested and debated characters in Nostradamus' works. Some have suggested he was a symbolic shoo-in for Saddam Hussein. Others see him as yet another Antichrist yet to be materialized, or even a literal representation of a man who shared the same name, former governor of Mississippi, Raymond Mabus. Redding suggests that there is some connection between this Mabus and the legend of Queen Mab, a fairy midwife of dreams, implying that in 2062, the world will take on a hallucinatory, nightmarish reality. He decides that, whatever its meaning, 2062 is a particularly bad time to be alive. Yet despite admitting that Mabus is impossible to truly define in this context, he tells us in his conclusion that this whole quatrain is in reference to the return of an epidemic that was once thought to be defeated, and that it kills more people than before. This pandemic only lasts a year, albeit proves to be much more deadly. As Nostradamus tells us, the earth shrinks, suggesting a frightfully high death toll. However, it's not all doom and gloom, because those who survive get to go travelling again, and do take advantage of this in this new era of peace. Of course, peace doesn't last that long because war is always inevitable, a war which Redding believes would make all former wars pale in comparison. A great war occurring in 2070. With the plague over, the earth shrinks. Peace will reign for a good while. People will travel through the sky like birds and by sea and wave before war once again is called for. Children will be moved around the islands. 2 out of every 7 will be in despair. The land will feed those who live by it. Only the spade will unify and give hope. By this point in 2064, England is full to the brim with overpopulation. Deprived of EU support, according to Redding, there will be a food crisis. 30% of the population will starve because of the overbuilding of houses in the Green Belt. Barely any countryside survives. Those who do live in the countryside and do have their own farms though will actually be alright. Redding warns that the modern Brit has become so urbanized that they have no idea how to work and harvest the land themselves. So a lot of us are going to die unless we all start a farming business. O great Roman one, your ruin approaches, not by your walls, but by your blood and substance. The asper, through letters, will cause such a terrible rift. Pointed steel would damage everything as far as the English Channel. In 2065, it's more bad news for the British, who can't get any support from the EU because, well, we've left it. Even though we'd have not been a part of the EU for over 40 years by this point. Redding describes that there is a crisis within Europe with arguments over the nuclear market, money, and of course war. He doesn't tell us anything really concrete here, however. Inside the quince, he will offer himself to Luna, where he will be taken and placed in a strange land. The unripe fruits will cause great unpleasantness, great blame, but to one, great praise. In this particular quatrain, Redding admits that it's notoriously difficult to interpret and that no commentator could possibly do so correctly. In his attempt, Redding focuses on the mention of Luna in line 1, reminding us that Luna, an alternative for Selene in the Greek myths, once fell in love with Endymion, the setting sun, who was condemned with an endless sleep. In any case, they're still able to have 50 children together, which Redding gives the impression that this quatrain pertains to fertility. He also becomes fixated with the fruit of the quince, something which Nostradamus was said to have been fond of, and also something representative of fertility. Somehow, Redding comes out with the conclusion that this quatrain is a warning to humanity about the dangers of unfettered scientific thinking, specifically in regarding fertility treatments. He notes, "They have become so sophisticated and so convenient that they are threatening to replace nature, to our eventual cost as human beings." "2066 also sees the fallout between England and Scotland, something you might say has been brewing for a number of years. Scotland weren't too happy to leave the EU, which was spearheaded by England, and Redding suggests England effectively forced Scotland's hand by denying them independence from the UK and forced them to go along with the plan. Scotland comes to align itself more closely with France in a bid to re-enter the EU and leave the United Kingdom, whilst England starts doing its best to become America Light, perhaps even becoming a puppet to America. The quatrain reads, "London's Prime Minister, ruled by America, will freeze out the Scottish enclave. The Rob Roys will pick themselves so false an Antichrist that they will all be thrown into the mix." "2067 sees the beginning of a great famine, something we see Nostradamus speak of in the first person in this quatrain. Redding argues that this reflects not only the severity of the prediction, but also Nostradamus' own personal feelings, who had lost his wife and children to a plague during a time where France was tormented with war and famine. In fact, his wife and children died in these conditions, so this one might have been quite personal to Nostradamus. "The great famine which I sense is approaching will start intermittently, but gradually become universal. So great and so long will it be that roots will be torn from the trees, and infants from their mother's breast." The overarching irony of Nostradamus being able to predict the future and warn others over such complex matters, yet not foresee the death of his own wife and children, is not lost on Redding. He notes that the townspeople turned on him and weren't all that convinced that he was able to decipher anything at all of future events. Tensions grow between England and France in 2068, with France attempting to fully eject England from any European intervention, specifically their influence in the nuclear market. When soldiers mutter mutinously, unsheathing steel at night against their chief, Albion's enemy will struggle furiously to upset Rome and seduce it from its principles. That great global war that Nostradamus has been barking on about for over 50 years is now finally at hand. Redding tells us that there are now rumblings of this war in the year 2069, and that despite efforts of a newly elected leader to steer other world leaders away from this course, their words fall upon deaf ears. The shining deed of the newly elected elder will be blown south by the great northern wind. Great halls are raised by his own sweat. Fleeing, he is killed at the bushes of Amberlin. 2069 also sees an asteroid striking the Earth that has drastic global effects. Tsunamis are triggered, rising between 300 and 800 meters above sea level. Fire and dust storms circumnavigate the globe. The sun is blotted out for 1 to 2 years. everything is effectively turned to shit. The great mountain, 7 stades around. After peace, war, hunger, flood will roll far, destroying great swathes of country, even antiquities and mighty foundations. The Great War is upon us. 2070 marks the date by which Nostradamus predicted this conflict that was capable of disturbing mountains, that captured both men and women, and saw mass suffering from country to country. Mark it on your calendars because we're all getting drafted. Well, some of you watching this are. From the regions governed by Libra, a great war will come, enough to disturb the mountains. Both sexes will be captured, and all Byzantium, so that cries will be heard at dawn from country to country. Reading reasons that the regions governed by Libra, Libra being the balance of power, are the US and China. For whatever reason, Reading decides that these two global figureheads aren't warring after years and years of tension, but rather only come to blows because Byzantium, the former empire comprising of modern-day Islamic countries, triggers the conflict by lighting the fuse. In his summary, Reading notes that men and women will both have combat roles, and that regardless of battles won by either country, everyone will feel like they've suffered. His second quatrain of this war reads, "Slicing armor is hidden in the torches. Inside Lyon, on the day of the sacred mountain, those of Vienna will be put in the mincer by the Latin cantons. Machen does not lie." I won't dissect Reading's interpretation on this one too much, because he honestly goes on a tangent about the Prophet Muhammad, which I think at this point is just a reflection of his own beliefs. I'm all for people making outlandish interpretations, but if your justification is as flimsy as his, I don't think they're worth repeating. His conclusion here is that thermonuclear weapons will be deployed on the battlefield in 2070, and that after this, nothing will ever be the same again. In his third quatrain on the war, he writes, "The spear from the skies will complete its extinguishing. It will speak of death, a terrible execution. The proud nation will be returned to the stone in the tree. Rumours of a human monster being first catharsis, then sacrifice." Because of the detonations of these thermonuclear weapons, the war actually comes to an end the same year it started. Reading tells us that there is unparalleled destruction, and entire countries are just simply not there anymore. Now, you might remember the birth of the young poor Muslim man back in 2035, with whom Reading equates with one of the Antichrists. Well, Reading believes that that man is the human monster in the 4th line of this quatrain, and that now he's all grown up and ready to make his move. Previously, Reading described him as being influential and seductive, and that has not changed in his interpretation here, where he leads us to believe that this man was not only partly responsible for the war, but will now actively be benefiting from it. In the next quatrain for 2070, Nostradamus wrote, "He will enter, ugly, bad and infamous. He will tyrannize Mesopotamia. Friends will pretend that the adulterous one has a soul. The land is horrible and black of aspect." Yet again, Reading suggests this is in reference to the same man as aforementioned, the Antichrist. Supposedly, he will create a power base in the Middle East, and because of his wit and charm, people from all over the world will start to believe in him. Perhaps need to believe in him, for there is no one else they can look to in these very dark and desolate times. In the next quatrain, Nostradamus wrote, "The islanders will face a long siege. They will defend themselves vigorously. Those outside will be assailed by hunger. It will be a far worse famine than those which preceded it." Reading believes that the islanders mentioned here are in reference to the British people. Here he believes that their efforts during the last famine to relocate to the countryside and cultivate more farmlands after having built over them all is something of a success. With this, the famine is still pretty bad in Britain, but at least not everyone starves. In fact, there is some suggestion that as the war nears its conclusion, Britain actually becomes quite self-sustaining. What's more, because of the bitterness between the UK and Europe, as per Reading's interpretations, The UK shares none of its food with the neighbouring countries, and in a bid to save itself, does not let anyone in. In his conclusion, Reading suggests that for once, Britain actually refrained from getting involved in the war, perhaps finally turning its back on America too, and that because of this, they emerged from the Great War pretty unscathed by comparison. He writes, "While a significant part of the rest of the world goes hungry, Britain has become self-sufficient and manages to feed its own people." Reading doesn't speak of the remaining years in this half of the decade, which gives the impression that it is just more of the same grueling suffering in the aftermath of the war. Fast forward to 2075 and we are given a new quatrain, telling us, "The cry of an extraordinary bird will be heard canoeing through the air shafts. The cost of a bushel of wheat corn will soar so high that man will make of man a cannibal." The extraordinary bird mentioned in the first line of this quatrain might be associated with the phoenix, on account that, like humanity during the war, it perished, but would rise again and be born anew. With this, Reading suggests that by this point, humanity enters a new age of uncertainty and global change, an era marked by barbarism and immorality that echoes the Dark Ages. What's more, there is a famine so bad that people will actually turn cannibal during these lawless times. Another quatrain for 2075 reads, "The eagerly awaited one will never return to Europe, but will appear in Asia. One of the Confederacy, descended from great Hermes. He will grow above all other kings of the Orient." Reading believes that this eagerly awaited one is again in reference to the aforementioned Antichrist, who now demonstrates his incredible influence by becoming above all other kings in the East. What's more, Reading infers that the Antichrist rejects Europe, and from his base of power in Mesopotamia, now Iraq, moves on to incorporate China and the surrounding Asian countries under his wing. You'll notice that the first line of the quatrain reads "the eagerly awaited one," which gave me the sense that Nostradamus might have been alluding to the return of Jesus in biblical prophecy, and that Jesus rejects Europe in favour of the Asian continent. After all, the Antichrist in Reading's example never went away. He's apparently always been there stirring up conflict, so it's hard to imagine that he would be eagerly awaited. Yet Reading can't seem to stomach the idea that Jesus doesn't choose Europe, and so does his best to further associate this with something evil, rather than something good. By 2077, Reading tells us that the Great War has completely come to an end, and that tyranny has its hold on what is left of the earth. Here he interprets that despite the influence and cunning of the Antichrist, he will either be beaten here or will begin to lose hold of what he has come to control. The third Antichrist will soon be annihilated. His war will have lasted for 27 years. The heretics are dead, captive or exiled. Human blood reddens the water that covers the earth in hail. Reading describes the final line as being one of the hardest lines to translate, but that this alludes to a time of great strife and suffering, almost on the same scale as the Ice Age millions of years ago. 2077 also sees the British come under attack. Remember, the UK has by this point become something of a fortress and is fully self-sufficient in growing its own food. Therefore, it is constantly under siege by other countries trying to get in. Yet Britain appears to be successful in repelling these attacks, though there are some traitors and deserters amongst the nation who build underground tunnels and escape to join the rest of the world. By arcs of fire, pitch and flame are they repulsed. Screams, cries and shouts at midnight. They are launched from inside the smashed defences. The traitors escape through their secret passages. In 2078, Reading speaks of more insurrections and political discourse, though doesn't go into much detail beyond this. After the Great War, the damage to the world and to society in general is irredeemable. Yet this does not stop various political parties attempting to come to power and lead by a brand new tyranny. I'm reminded of the various gangs of the Dark Ages, whereby in the Arthurian take, any man could make himself king, so long as he had the men and means to justify it. Sudden joy inside sudden sadness will occur at Rome of the jealousy guarded favours, mourning, cries, tears, weeping blood, excellent joy, opposing groups surprised and locked up. Of 2079, Nostradamus writes, "The locked and fated eternal order of things will switch direction thanks to a new order. The old Greek order will be broken, its citadel taken, the enemy will not be accepted." Redding interprets this as the beginning of a new world order and the end of democracy as we know it. Supposedly, there will be a great mourning for the old ways, but there is no turning back. Perhaps this new tyrannic government that apparently comes into power is the only way by which society can eventually be restored. In any case, Redding tells us that there will be a last-ditch attempt here to overthrow the government and this new world order. Because of the Great Global War of 2070, there is now a fundamental climate change that was triggered by the various nuclear detonations.
It's been raining like this for 3 days now.
The weather effects are so terrible that people actually start turning back to the idea of God, and there is a resurgence of prayer and religion in these desperate times. The blood of innocents, of widows and virgins, the Great Red One, committed many evils. Holy images are infused with the light of votive candles. Terrified and fearful, people will no longer dare to move. An example of this climate change comes in the form of a volcanic eruption that erupts beneath the Tyrrhenian Sea, causing a great tsunami that devastates the Roman peninsula. Near the great river, a ditch will form. The land will be eaten. The water will split into 15 channels. The city falls. Fire, blood, and cries conflict, much of it caused by the collision. There are more natural disasters in 2081, specifically one particularly vengeful tsunami that strikes between Greece and Egypt. This causes great havoc on the Turkish mainland. The royal bird will fly over the city of the sun. 7 months earlier, there will be a nocturnal augury. The eastern wall will fall amidst thunder and lightning. For 7 unremitting days, the enemy will be at the gates. Redding comes to this conclusion by suggesting that the royal bird in line 1 of the quatrain is in relation to the ibis, which is sacred to Egypt. The city of the sun, meanwhile, he believes is representative of Rhodes in Greece, because of its association to Apollo the sun god. Again, it isn't really clear where he gets the idea of the tsunami from. By this point in the future, it honestly reads like he's making stuff up again, but I guess we'll find out. A new leader also makes himself known in 2081. We are told, the great scolder, bold and shameless, will be elected head of the army. The boldness of his contentions will cause the bridge to break and the city to faint with fear. Redding tells us that this man is a strong leader who, funnily enough, for the first time ever, happens to be benevolent. His arrival couldn't have been better timed because it is during this period of earthquakes, tsunamis, and active volcanoes that the world is in desperate need of leadership. This man, described by Nostradamus as the Great Scolder, isn't afraid to confront those already in power and proceeds to even shout his way to the head of the army. According to Redding, the people will look for miracles in this man, but alas, he is not capable of delivering them. Another earthquake in 2082 rocks the whole of Europe, when even the trees shake mightily and the south wind seems covered in blood. So many will try to escape that Vienna and all Austria will shake with their passing. Redding comes to this conclusion by the use of the word shake, which appears twice in this quatrain. This earthquake is so large that it is felt from Vienna to Austria. Things also get quite biblical in 2082 with the emergence of a locust plague. Fréjus, Antibes, and the towns around Nice will be devastated both by land and sea. Locusts will come on propitious winds, kidnap, death, rape, pillage, no martial law. Redding puts it rather bluntly, telling us that the Mediterranean is in for it, for this is primarily where many of the aforementioned disasters will take place. Redding interprets continuous metro-esque storms in these areas, followed by the plagues of locusts, and finally a total end to all law and order, where people go mad and revert to a more bestial and wicked nature. Redding determines that only the strong will survive. When the sun is at 20 degrees in Taurus, a great earthquake will totally destroy the packed Great Theatre. Air, sky and earth will be murky and unsettled, so that even infidels will call on God and the saints to steer them. If one is able to survive 2083, they'd likely be able to survive anything. Redding tells us that these years of the early 2080s are the worst that humanity will ever have to go through. During this time, there will be a mass return to religion, and that everyone will once again start looking to God, or the gods, for aid upon the earth. What's more, Redding believes that this quatrain pertains to New York City in particular, and that this great earthquake sees the fall of many great buildings. He comes to this conclusion because it is during this time that, in terms of astronomy, and astrology I guess, Jupiter will be in Taurus and Neptune in Leo. I'm not even going to pretend to understand the symbolism and meaning behind this. In any case, Redding tells us that the last time this happened, it was during the time of the Wall Street crash in June 1929. It seemingly spells disaster for New York each time these planets are aligned, so with that, Redding believes this massive earthquake is the Big Apple's burden to bear. He will be born of the pit and of the immeasurable city, product of dark and infernal parents, who wish the power of the great and revered king, to be destroyed by Rowan and Everu. Yep, Redding tells us from this quatrain that yet another Antichrist is bound here, but doesn't go into much detail beyond this. We also learn that this is the year of the last pope. Nostradamus tells us the king makes a statement completing the hecatomb. After having discovered its origin, a flood of marble and lead opens the tomb of a great Roman of the Medusan persuasion. Redding really goes around the houses on this one, telling us that the Medusan persuasion in the final line of this quatrain is in reference to Medusa, and that the flood of marble in line 3 is her turning things to stone. For whatever reason, this gives him the notion of the name Peter, Peter being the very first pope. Where he gets the name Peter from, he doesn't say. It seems to be just his own intuition coming into effect here. He then randomly starts citing from a prophecy of popes by a Saint Malachi, and notes that the final pope in that classification is named Petrus Romanus. Therefore, the final pope will likely be named Peter, or Petrus, and this will happen in 2084. Right at the point where he previously stated that religion will have a resurgence. The old demagogue, salt measure teetering, will be urged never to release the captive. The old man, though not weak, does not wish to be maligned. By legitimate means, he delivers him to his friends. Redding's interpretation of this quatrain suggests that there is a crisis in France that will last the rest of the decade. He comes to this conclusion by suggesting that the use of salt in the first line of the quatrain pertains to an evil omen when it is spilled, and that this will be the case for the French people. He also attempts to reconcile the idea that Judas spilled the salt shaker at the Last Supper, so salt in this instance is a foreboding aspect. Because the salt is usually shaken in its shaker, there's a further suggestion that there will be some upheaval or chaos in France. The captive in question is unknown, but Redding suggests that this is the smooth-talking Antichrist who instigated the global war, who at this stage would be 50 years old. What's more, the old man in line 3 is believed by Redding to be an elderly leader, who though doesn't set the Antichrist free, does deliver him to his friends, where his captivity is believed to continue. 2085 also sees Redding take a stab at predicting the future of Israel. Oh boy. The old man conceals stern laws beneath his beard. The lion is raised above the wedge-shaped eagle. The great man, small in size, persists too long. There is the sound of weapons from the sky. The Red Sea turns Ligurian. I won't bother dissecting everything Redding says about this quatrain. You can probably already guess the future of Israel without me having to go into too much detail. Basically, Israel and Palestine are still fighting, and would you believe it, a new war is kicked off between them here. Redding concludes, both sides find it impossible to forgive and forget the past. A forceful Israeli leader takes the initiative, triggering a fresh war. Nostradamus skips the next 4 years, and we can only assume it's just more misery given the previous few years. By 2089, we are told, at this time Cyprus will be frustrated in its desire for aid from the Greeks. The old will be snuffed out, both by cannon and by distress. Their king will be seduced, their queen even more affronted. Israel and Palestine aren't the only ones to continue their age-old feud. Greece and Turkey continue to argue over Cyprus, according to Redding's interpretation of this quatrain. In fact, there is even a restoration of the monarchy in Greece, which sees the Greeks make a more self-assured attempt at re-establishing the whole island as their territory. Yet another rivalry, this time between the US and China, signs off the end of the decade, though not for the reasons you might expect. After having bombed each other to smithereens in the global war of the early 2070s, the US and China decide to become friends? One day, the two great leaders will become friends. Their great power will become greater. The new world will be at its highest point. The number shall be told to the Red One. So after the extreme carnage and devastation of the global war of the 2070s, America and China basically kiss and make up, and there seems to be a period of peace. Climate change is pretty much over, according to Redding, and the effects of the nuclear fallout have finally come to wane, although I would have thought it would have taken at least another 100 years for it to have been safe to even breathe the air. Seemingly desperate to finally have a good prediction, Redding doesn't seem all that keen to look a gift horse in the mouth, and describes it as churlish to question the quatrain and dilute the glory of one of Nostradamus' few partially optimistic predictions. Life and death change the rule of Hungary. Law becomes more asper than duty. Their great city rings with cries and laments. Castor and Pollux confront each other in the lists. In 2090, there is believed by Redding to be a short and sharp crisis in Hungary. His reasoning for this is based primarily on the first line of the quatrain, which can be taken quite literally. He attempts to make sense of the remaining 3 lines, but these don't really fit into his greater prediction. He concludes that though Hungary goes through this crisis, it is an unlikely saviour that resolves the problem. Also in 2090, Greece has a nuclear incident. We are told, in the Cyclades, and in Perinthus, and Larissa, in Sparta, and all through Peloponnese, a terrible famine, a plague of false dust. 9 months will it last, patterning everything. Redding proceeds to explain that the terrible famine and plague of false dust in line 3 of the quatrain is an act of God, perhaps a natural disaster, not something man-made for once. It seems as if no one is too keen to start another nuclear war so soon after the events of 2070, and so the destruction that takes place here in Greece appears to be either a natural occurrence or some other unfortunate tragedy. Redding proposes that after the global fallout, Greece invests in nuclear reactors, but that one of the reactors malfunctions and results in a Chernobyl-like tragedy. The fallout from the disaster lingers for 9 months and will affect both the living and the unborn. It will seem to human beings that the gods must have been the authors of the Great War. Once, long ago, the sky was clear of weapons, whereas now, on the left hand, there is damage still to come. Previously, Redding implied that the effects of the fallout were on the way out. But here, 20 years after the nuclear war, he suggests that the fallout is far from over, and that there is long-term emotional, ecological, and thermonuclear damage. Here he predicts that great powers, presumably the world leaders, will come together at a conference and deeply ponder on the future of the planet. There is a general sense of nostalgia amongst humanity, who now long for the old days. Their joint rule won't last long. In 3 years and 7 months' time, they will go to war. The 2 virgins will rebel against them. The victor is later born on American soil. Redding believes that this is a prelude to the French crisis that will occur in 2098, that which will manifest in 3 years and 7 months from 2095. The 2 virgins mentioned in line 3 appear to be Joan of Arc, the spirit of French national pride, or Marianne, the girl with the Phrygian cap seen on French monuments, stamps and coins, who Redding states is a symbol of Republican France and freedom. In some way, Redding implies that there will be 2 figures like this in this year who oppose the joint rule, perhaps America and China. Their work is pretty much done for them though, because by the looks of things, America and China have another tiff, which leads to war, with America seemingly winning, the victor being born on American soil. Redding suggests that it was one of these French virgins who will be born on American soil, and that somehow, in the end, France will be the victor of the conflict. But none of this is really explained properly by Redding, who admits it's difficult to interpret. 2095 also sees the ecological burnout. Formerly inhabited lands will become unfit for human life. Cultivable fields will be divided up. The power will be given to overcautious fools. From that moment on, death and discord for the Great Brothers. Here, Redding essentially interprets that many areas of the world are now simply uninhabitable, and that absolutely none of the world leaders know what they're doing. Kind of like now, really. The man whose duty it is to destroy fantasy-driven temples and sects will confine himself to the inanimate, and to those whose ears are filled with vainglory. Redding considers who this man is in this quatrain. He suspects it might be the Pope, but that can't really be the case if we had the last Pope back in 2084. Redding further considers if this is someone who is commissioned by a secular superstate, but either way, it pertains to someone going around uprooting and abolishing temples akin to Josiah in the Bible. Redding worries that this might be the new government's attempt to finally crush religion under its heel, and to eradicate the new hope that people have found in God in these troubling times. Redding compares this effort to the 1940s Russian secularization under Stalin, although this man in this quatrain seems to focus on destroying temples, not people. Even if this man is successful in destroying churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, his efforts are ultimately in vain, because in that same year, a new religion emerges. A religion with the name of the sea will win, against the sect of the bound and captive son. This obstinate and much more deplored sect will live in fear of the 2 injured by Aleph and Aleph. Here, Redding tells us that Aleph in this last line of the quatrain is the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet, while the similar sounding Alif is also the first letter of the Arabic alphabet. With that in mind, he comes to the conclusion that this new religion will oppose both Christianity and Islam. Furthermore, the bound and captive son is believed to be Jesus Christ, which, according to Redding, implies that many will come to abandon Jesus in favour of this new religion. "2097 kicks off with trouble in the Middle East. We are told, new laws will rule new lands, towards Syria, Judea and Palestine. The great barbarian empire will decay, before Phoebus concludes his dominance of the century." Redding fixates on the barbarian empire in line 3 of this quatrain, suggesting that it could either be the Jewish side that ends up decaying or the Arab side which ends up decaying. In any case, there is a sign here that the conflict in the Middle East will finally come to an end with one side surrendering, and that there will be new laws and new lands. "The redolent ashes of the joyful virgin will darken for a long time. There will be no salt, black marketeers, ruffians and odious wolves, pell-mell everywhere." Once again, Redding uses the term virgin to mean Joan of Arc and a symbol of the French spirit, that which will darken in these times. Once again, he also considers the use of salt here in line 2, that which is again decidedly a bad omen. All in all, he comes to the conclusion that this is the beginning of the French crisis that's been foreshadowed in the previous years, where the French state erupts into anarchy. "The learned enemy will turn about in confusion. The mighty army sickens, brought low by ambush. Both the hills of the Pyrenees and of the Apennines will be closed to him. Old containers will be discovered near the river." Redding doesn't dissect each of Nostradamus' lines to come to his conclusion here, but is rather quick in deciding that the French army will be brought in order to restore order and neutralize the anarchy, but that they only end up making it worse. "For a long time a grey bird will be seen, high above Dole and Tuscany, holding in its beak a flowering branch. The great one will soon die, and the war shall end." Redding tells us that the grey bird in this quatrain is actually a dove of peace, and that the flowering branch in its beak is actually an olive branch, which he adds is seen as representative of the Holy Ghost in some Christian iconography. He concludes that the Great One who dies in the final line is actually one of the leaders who triggered the French crisis in the first place, and that his death will bring about a resolution to the conflict. Further into 2100, another quatrain pertaining to the French crisis appears to spill over into the fortress of Britain. "A horrible tumult in the islands. Soon only the warlike cabal will be heard. So great will be the predators' insults, that a great league will form against them." Redding details here that the islands in the first line of this quatrain is assuredly Britain, and considering its proximity to France, there is bound to be yet another conflict here. France is described as the predator here, perhaps still seeking to gain access to Britain for its great reserves of food. In any case, Redding determines that this will not be an invasion on behalf of the French, but merely a great falling out between the two nations, who, let's be honest, aren't all that fond of each other anyway. "A treaty between enemies is not kept. The captives are not released. The leader is captured and killed. His remains are stripped. The rest are damned for sustaining him." Rather amusingly, Redding just sort of gives up at this point and describes the year 2101 as being too far from home to make any real sense of. Considering the quatrain is so close in time to the previous 3, Redding is sure it pertains to the French crisis, but isn't all that sure how to justify it. He concludes that France is forced to face up to the root cause of its recent crisis, and that the instigators of this episode are eventually brought down. there's more global warming trouble heading into the 22nd century. We are told, due to the sun overheating the sea, the fish from Negroponte will be parboiled. The local inhabitants will claim them, while people in Rhodes and Genoa are starving. Redding concludes from this quatrain that global warming gets so bad that the summer in this particular year causes the sea to be boiled. This then leads to the shallower part of the Mediterranean Sea becoming like pea soup, and that fish, with nowhere to escape to, end up getting boiled as well. People in Rhodes and Genoa will go hungry because of this, and yet another famine is introduced to these regions. When a letter is enclosed inside an iron fish, the man who emerges is entitled to make war. His fleet will travel beneath the bowels of the sea, reappearing near a Latin land. Redding believes that Nostradamus was referring to submarines here. He bases this on the use of iron fish in the first line of the quatrain, but again, you might argue that this is a bit of a stretch. From this, Redding concludes that there is a diplomatic crisis that is triggered at the United Nations, and that a fleet of submarines is sent to quell the disturbance and make war if the situation warrants it. Mario Redding doesn't continue in the same format with Nostradamus' predictions, but rather fast forwards to the year 7048 to give his thoughts of what he interprets as the final days on Earth. I won't spend any more time talking about those here. This video is probably like 2 hours long, so we'll save that for another time. Besides, I think by now we've probably had our fill of the future, and I for one can't stomach any more of the dark and bleak events that Nostradamus has in store for us. Additionally, as a little post disclaimer, I personally wouldn't really take any of these quatrains to heart, nor the interpretations by Mario Redding. Whilst I can see the intrigue and the value of such a work in the eyes of entertainment, I wouldn't classify them as anything more than that. As I mentioned, Redding makes quite a few leaps with his conclusions, and at other times he definitely seems to be just making stuff up. Nonetheless, I encourage you to check out the work for yourself and for you to come to your own conclusions on what these quatrains mean, if anything. As always guys, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to leave this video a like and subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.